Mongolians are voting in a new parliament. At stake, how to spread the wealth of the country's mining boom. The money's rolling in, but the people are still poor. And overshadowing everything, the blight of corruption. What are the challenges ahead for Mongolia's new government? This is Inside Story. Hello there, thanks for joining us. I'm Shuli Ghosh. Thursday is a crucial day for the people of Mongolia. They're choosing their next government. And the question for voters is this: how should this poor, landlocked country spend the money from its mining boom? A third of Mongolia's 3 million people live below the poverty line. Many say they haven't seen any benefit from the massively growing economy. And the biggest danger to Mongolia's future comes from corruption. Steve Chow reports.
Mongolia is the world's most sparsely populated country. And so on this, a crucial election day, many travel long distances from the remote grasslands by bus and by more traditional means, turning a car park at this rural polling station into a stable.
What is important to me is that there will be leaders with a genuine Mongolian way of thinking who really care for the people. Corruption is so bad, and right now there is no equality. Half is getting richer, the other half poorer.
With the newfound wealth of a nation at stake, government officials pledged to reflect the will of the public with a clean election. Independent observers have been invited in. Security cameras beam live video from remote areas to other observers in the capital. And for the first time, Mongolians, many of whom are still nomadic herders, are learning how to vote electronically. The catchphrase in these elections, echoed by all political parties, is to provide a fair and just government. From recent experiences in the past, many people believe that not following through with this promise this time around will carry heavy consequences. In the last parliamentary elections, rioters burned cars and buildings after accusations of widespread vote rigging. 5 people were killed. Controversy has risen again, this time with supporters of the former president accusing his rivals of making up charges of corruption. With his case before the courts, Nambaran Angbayar, arguably Mongolia's most popular political figure, has been barred from running. That corruption is common among the political elite, and that the poor, estimated at 1 out of every 3 in the country, have yet to see the benefits of a resource boom, is something the president admits to.
Corruption is a big problem. Because of corruption, because of bad governance, I think most of the emerging societies are failing and failed. We are not want to repeat that.
Beyond mineral wealth, Mongolians treasured their democracy. Formed in 1990 following the collapse of the Soviet Union, people still wear their finest to vote. And so, under the watchful eye of the country's greatest ruler, Genghis Khan, Mongolians are choosing a new generation of leaders and hoping their choice will ensure an opportunity and prosperity for all. For Inside Story, I'm Steve Chow in Torels, Mongolia.
So, how is the Mongolian government going to handle its booming economy? And what's it going to do about its rampant corruption? Let's bring in today's guests. From Mongolia's capital, Ulaanbaatar, we have Jagolseikan Dambadaja joining us via Skype. He's a Mongolian columnist, television host, economist and management consultant. In Hong Kong, Andrew Leung, an economist and political commentator. He's also the government of Hong Kong's former representative to Britain. And in Cambridge, David Sneath, Director of Studies in Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Cambridge and former Director of the university's Mongolia and Inner Asia Study Unit. Gentlemen, a warm welcome to all three of you. Thank you for joining us. Jagolseikan, let's start with you since you are there in the capital. Many are calling this the most important election ever for Mongolia because it's a crucial time and the time for change is now.
Yes, it is, because this country is getting such a big revenue from its mines, wealth under the ground. And it's now important how to deal with that revenue for the sake of the people, for the sake of the growth becoming the really life factor for every Mongolian.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about this election is that people are really invested in it, aren't they? I mean, the turnout is predicted to be something like 80% or more.
Yeah, what I keep hearing now is a little bit lower, but it was before closing the booths, but around probably close to 70, which is already very high.
Now, you were talking about the mineral wealth there. Of course, one of the key questions is how that wealth is distributed, Jagol Seykin. And I understand that in Ulaanbaatar, where you are, in the capital, you can see a lot of that wealth in terms of new buildings and new roads. What's it like outside the capital, though? Well,
the Mongolian capital is becoming very much modern, very vibrant city. You will see very high rises, 20 plus floors, which is quite high in this town. And we see more modern restaurants, people, cars, in particular big cars. You know, we like horses, and probably it's converted to big cars. You will see every car. I saw a few hours ago Bentley on the road. Though the roads have still some big potholes, very symbolic to our economy and their current life. And the Ulaanbaatar city people we want to have a normal life here.
Indeed. Let me bring in David. It's funny that massive traffic jams are always a sign of burgeoning wealth, but this is the key election issue, isn't it? The fairer distribution of wealth.
Absolutely it is. Mongolia has seen this enormous resource boom just beginning, and it's as important in terms of expectation as it is in terms of actual delivered material standards of living. So the whole of the country has been promised a lot from the resource boom, which the big mining corporations say is just around the corner. And the difficulty is that Mongolia needs to find a way of distributing that wealth a bit better, because the experience of everyday Mongolians since the 90s has been one in which a small section have got wealthy, but a lot of the rest of the population haven't seen very much by way of economic benefit over the last 20 years. So the nature of the party politics, including the recent rather dramatic split in the old ruling party, that has really crystallized this discussion about what some people are describing as resource nationalism, that is, how to negotiate with the big foreign companies to get the best deal for the Mongolian citizen. So that's one of the really important issues. And alongside, as you mentioned in your introduction, is of course the way in which the elites, the political and economic elites, are relating to each other, how they handle the wealth that's available. And so the idea of corruption or of underhand dealings, of elites feathering their own nests, this has made social justice a really central issue in this election campaign. Yeah, and we are going to talk about corruption in a lot more depth because it is an important issue. But it is fair to say that the politicians in Mongolia are going to have to work pretty hard to get people's trust back. I think that's true, and I think that at the moment the Mongolian people, the public, which is a very well-informed public, there's a lot of media, television and newspaper coverage, a very good level of general engagement and interest in politics. The Mongolian public are kind of really going to are waiting to be convinced. There's been a lot of scandal to do with corruption in the last, well, I have to say more than 10, 15, 20 years really. And as the stakes get higher, with more and more money potentially available, people are getting more, feeling more strongly about the need for public officials to act in the correct way and also to try and redistribute a bit of this wealth that's coming in. And Andrew, let me bring you in and introduce one more element to all of this, because we know that the wealth in Mongolia is astounding. Apparently it's got enough coal there to fuel China's needs for 50 years. So this is clearly a country that China is exercising a lot of influence on.
No doubt that China, of course, is Mongolia's biggest customer as far as its resources are concerned. But the importance of Mongolia to China is more than just resources, because Mongolia, of course, sits up north of China as a buffer with Russia. And also, China sees Mongolia is in a bigger geopolitical context vis-a-vis, for example, the connections with Central Asia through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and also involving Mongolia regionally in other regions as well. The importance to China is that China doesn't want to see Mongolia to be getting away from into other blocs, for example, with more allied with Russia, impinging on China's territorial interests, or allying with the United States. For example, the United States has been also increasing investment in Mongolia, not just for the resources, but also as a global China balancing or containment policy that extends, of course, not only to the South China Sea, but also to other parts of the world. So for China, Mongolia is part of a global, if not just it's more than a regional, it's a global kind of jigsaw puzzle.
Okay, this is a good point to actually just enlighten our viewers about some background on Mongolia. Now, the country is wedged between China and Russia. It has massive deposits of coal, copper, gold and uranium. The government estimates that its mineral reserves are worth around $1.2 trillion. Now, Mongolia's economy grew by 17.3% last year. That's one of the fastest growing in the world. The current elections will be the 7th since Mongolia ended 7 decades of communist rule in 1990. But, as we've already mentioned, its democracy is threatened by its high levels of corruption. Mongolia is ranked 120 out of 183 countries on Transparency International's Corruption Index of 2011. We'll come back to corruption in a minute. I just want to ask Andrew this question before I get a reaction from Jargal Seikan. We were talking about Mongolia's strategic importance and geographical importance for China. The fact that Mongolia is landlocked with China as being one area where it has to get exports out, China's pretty much exploiting that, isn't it? I mean, it's making Mongolia pay, or it's paying Mongolia 30% less for its commodities than they would get on the open market. So Mongolia is pretty vulnerable to Chinese influence.
It's a kind of, it's open to negotiations, of course. But you're quite right that the Mongolia is landlocked and it requires an access to the sea. And the current access is via the eastern seaboard of China, particularly in the port near Tianjin. And of course, that would be China's leverage against a certain unwelcome developments. And one of the main worry for China is the possible rise of a pan-Mongolian kind of nationalism, because that would give rise to sentiments uniting the Inner Mongolia, which is a part of China's province, with Mongolia, and even with a certain Mongolian region in Russia.
Well,
so that would be an unwelcome separatist movement for China.
But Jargal Seikan, I mean, just how worried are people in Mongolia about growing foreign interests? Because there is a nationalistic feeling there. They want to control their own wealth. They don't want foreign companies controlling their wealth.
Well, I don't want you guys to see that it is too much over blooming all this stuff, because this country has 50% of the population is under 35 years old, well educated. Many of them have foreign education, and they know that what is the best for this country. We need foreign direct investment. Yes, because the mining wealth is not distributed to everybody well. There is, of course, resentment and people not happy, but people are aware that it is because we don't have a good public governance. Remember, this is a democratic country, unlike our two neighbors. And whatever parliament have decisions, people can go against, because it's a democratic country. And that's why in this country, we have a very broad discussions issue on every issue. That's why it is very difficult sometimes to make one decisions because by nature of the democracy. But however, if it is made, it's for long. And that's the very factor making different this small in terms of population country, different than China and Russia.
What do you think, David? I mean, there is a bit of a battle going on, isn't there, between Washington and Beijing and lots of global mining companies trying to get a bite of the cherry?
Yes, there is. But I'd also just like to mention Mongolian democracy one more time, because I think the point just made just then was a very good one. Mongolia punches way above its weight in terms of democracy, by which mostly it's meant governments of our type. And Mongolia has very successfully introduced some parliamentary multi-party democracy since the 90s in a most extraordinary peaceful coup, where something like Tiananmen Square in China resulted not in the tanks rolling over demonstrators, but instead in the entire government resigning and introducing a multi-party democracy. And this achievement in the 90s meant that Mongolia has a very active and vibrant political culture, but it's become more and more problematic because of the relationship with money. The wealth hasn't flowed out very much. The elites have seen a lot of wealth, but it tends to be concentrated in a few sectors like mining and so on. So these problems, these internal problems, mean that when it comes to global relations with China and with Russia, Mongolia really does see itself as being related to, akin to, European and American and other Western European government systems. It tried to make that statement in terms of its political culture back in the 90s. And so the third neighbour policy, which is how it's described, reaching out beyond the two superpowers that lock Mongolia into this particular position in the continent, reaching out to Washington, yes, but also Berlin and London and Paris and Tokyo and other trading partners elsewhere in the globe. This is really important for Mongolia, not just politically, but culturally. The elites are very oriented towards this bigger international scene beyond just China and Russia, and the business deals reflect that.
And of course, as you mentioned there, again, the major issue is that this kind of wealth isn't trickling down to the poorer people. So we're back to the issue of corruption. This is the biggest obstacle to the population sharing in the boom that Mongolia is seeing.
Well, in some ways you could say that that is the case. It's very difficult, though, to be sure quite what Mongolia can do about it, because the resource boom, some kind of resource boom, the equivalent to a petrodollar economy, is not unique to Mongolia. And so it's not as if this is a particular product of rampant corruption. There is some corruption, okay, but I think actually the broader question is how one finds a way of transferring wealth from a narrow sector and from elites to a broader part of the population. And in the long run, actually, the long and the short of it is pretty simple, and that is, how do you get well-paid jobs in large numbers produced? If you could do that, I think the Mongolian public would be pretty forgiving of other kinds of corruption stories. But when that's not happening, then attention focuses on leaders who themselves are often becoming very wealthy, their families and their networks becoming very wealthy, but the rest of the population kind of not, and waiting for some benefits. So corruption is part of it, but it's also true to say that in Mongolia, the perception of corruption is not a simple one. It's not just a question of breaking laws. There's a general worry and concern about the rich and powerful feathering their own nests, whether or not they've broken a particular law or not. It's that sensation that money is there, but is not getting spread around very widely, that I think makes a lot of people worried. And they are worried about foreign interests, particularly, obviously, their great southern neighbour, China. They are quite concerned about limiting Chinese interests in their country.
Andrew, what do you think about that? Because as David says, there's this perception that foreign investment is leading to certain leaders in Mongolia feathering their own nests, and people are worried about the country ending up more like Nigeria, where you have this whacking great gap between the rich and the poor, and it leads to conflict and instability.
I think this is also part of the so-called resource curse, where the whole country is dependent on one single overweening sector, which is the energy. So I think that the challenge for Mongolia is to broaden the economy by investing a great deal more of its wealth in essential infrastructure like roads, highways, but also schools and hospitals, and bringing up the skills of its population, and thereby and also maybe broadening the economy into manufacturing or other sectors, so as to create, as my colleagues were saying, jobs for a more broader based middle class, and that would diffuse the kind of distribution of wealth in a way that would, in fact, could even minimize the corruption. But I think the corruption and concentration of wealth is not just in Mongolia, it's in other democracies around the world. I mean, there are references to the so-called 1% and the 99%, even in America. But I think the challenge for a small country like Mongolia, where there is so much concentration of national wealth in one single sector, I think the immediate challenge is to broaden the economy and improve the kind of governance institutions.
Jagol Saikan, what do you say to that? I mean, what are politicians saying about combating corruption there?
Yeah, two things. Before going the program about diversification of economy, I would like to share with you the general people's opinion about the value of democracy, value of freedom, protection of human rights, protection of your property. That value very much accepted by this society during the last 20 years. So people are demanding normal regulation, normal transparent government. And both large political parties, People's Party and the Democratic Party, are putting the same goal about diversification of economy based on the revenue from mining. And then here and there, some methods are different, but we both see that it can be done with vibrant, good competition of private sector. I think that's the most important part. And we say corruption is high also because we want to have a very fair competition. And we see that the country, the private businesses see that they need normal, fair competition, not the interference by the government or related people with the who are making decisions. That's why there's high demand of transparency in the government. If we will overcome that, then the issue of diversification of the economy, using all the funds from the revenue, etc., that's the agenda of any party who will take over from tomorrow.
So you're expecting a successful election this time round, because there was a bit of violence after the last elections, wasn't there?
Well, sure. That was a big lesson for everybody. That's why we have 4 colonels now in prison. That's why we have been asking the former president, even connected with the certain things we believe he should answer. And that's the part of democracy. We are on the way of cleaning the power from our corrupt officials. And I think this election will prove that we are on the right track. And the people, in particular the civic society, people are intolerant to 2 things. One is the mining licenses. The second is land speculation in Ulaanbaatar city. And we expect the current president will continue after even the election, all the way through the whole land speculation in the Ulaanbaatar city, which is a big source of that assumption of corruption in this country. So I think the democracy, the value of freedom works here, and we want to get fast, better.
OK, gentlemen, we have run out of time. It was an interesting discussion. Thank you very much indeed for your contributions. Thank you to all our guests, Jagol Saikan Dambadaja, Andrew Leung and David Sneath. And thank you at home for watching. We're always interested in what you think. Send us an email to insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Shudi Ghosh. Bye-bye for now.